For the cold-blooded execution of 4 parents, you are both sentenced to life
We didn't execute them, we erased them! I'd do it again! I'd kill the whole world for her!
We won. The inheritance is ours. We can't punish genius.
The 4 bodies were discovered on a crisp Sunday morning in Aspen, Colorado, when a neighbor noticed the ferryman's front door ajar and newspapers piling up in the driveway. Inside, responding officers found a scene of methodical violence. Everett and Marisol Ferryman in their bedroom, each with fatal gunshot wounds to the head, their bodies positioned as if they'd been asleep when killed. Across town in the upscale Mountain View subdivision, a similar scene awaited at the Tolbert residence where Victor had been shot in his home office and Nadine in the kitchen, suggesting they'd been in different parts of the house when the attack occurred. What initially appeared as possibly connected home invasions quickly evolved into something far more disturbing as investigators realized the missing element in both homes: the teenage children, 16-year-old Brian Ferryman and 17-year-old Lisa Tolbert, high school sweethearts whose obsessive relationship had troubled both sets of parents for months. The teens were located at a roadside motel in Grand Junction, 3 hours from Aspen, registered under false names, but easily identified by the desk clerk, who recognized them from the emergency alerts that had been issued. When the tactical team breached the room shortly after dawn on Monday, they found Brian and Lisa calmly sitting on the bed, watching television, with no apparent reaction to the armed officers surrounding them. According to the arresting officers, Lisa's first words weren't denial or shock, but a coldly practical question: can we have separate attorneys? Brian, meanwhile, remained silent, his eyes fixed on Lisa as if waiting for cues on how to respond, a dynamic that investigators would note repeatedly in subsequent interactions. Neither teen asked about their parents, expressed concern for what had happened, or showed visible distress at being apprehended, details that would later feature prominently in prosecutor Charlotte Phillips's opening statement as evidence of their callous detachment. If you're watching this true crime documentary, please hit subscribe and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now let's continue with this chilling case that shocked the affluent ski resort town of Aspen and raised disturbing questions about the extremes of teenage obsession. The investigation would eventually reveal that the quadruple homicide had been meticulously planned over weeks, with the teens selecting September 14th specifically because both families would be home, but neighbors on either side of both houses would be away for weekend trips. Security footage recovered from nearby homes showed what appeared to be the same figure moving between both residences in the early morning hours, wearing dark clothing and a hood. The murder weapon, a .22 caliber handgun stolen from Victor Tolbert's gun safe, was recovered from a dumpster behind a gas station along the route to Grand Junction, wrapped in a towel with both teens' DNA present. Lisa's fingerprints were found on 2 unfired bullets still in the magazine, while gunshot residue was detected on both teens' clothing even after they had changed, forensic evidence that would eventually dismantle their initial claims of innocence and their subsequent attempts to blame each other. The community of Aspen, accustomed to the occasional scandals of visiting celebrities but rarely touched by violent crime, reacted with collective shock as details emerged about the teenagers whose families had been fixtures in local society. The Ferrymans owned a successful property development company specializing in luxury vacation homes, while the Tolberts, Victor, a neurosurgeon at Aspen Valley Hospital, and Nadine, a prominent environmental attorney, had been featured in local news for their philanthropic work supporting underprivileged youth. School administrators described Brian and Lisa as academically gifted students who had been dating for approximately 9 months, with no disciplinary issues until recent weeks when teachers had reported concerning changes in their behavior. Friends of the teens described their relationship as intensely close, with one classmate telling detectives that Brian and Lisa acted like they were the only two people who existed, and another reporting that Lisa had recently stated that no one was going to keep them apart, no matter what it took. The first 48 hours of the investigation produced a compelling timeline, with credit card records showing Brian purchasing gloves, black clothing, and cleaning supplies 3 days before the murders. Cell phone location data placed both teens' phones moving between the two crime scenes in the early morning hours of September 14th, contradicting their initial claim of having left town the previous evening. What investigators lacked, however, was a clear understanding of motive beyond what appeared to be teenage rebellion against parental authority. That changed dramatically on Tuesday morning when Sarah Winters, the guidance counselor at Aspen Heights Academy, contacted Detective Noah Roberts with information about a troubling notebook she had discovered in Lisa's locker during a routine safety inspection conducted after the teens were taken into custody. Inside the spiral-bound notebook, beneath chemistry notes and college application drafts, were several pages of what appeared to be surveillance notes on both families' routines, including detailed observations about when each parent typically went to bed, which rooms they occupied, and whether they took sleep medications. The most damning evidence, however, was a phrase repeated twice on the final page of notes, underlined and circled. "After Saturday, nothing stands in our way." This single line, written in Lisa's distinctive handwriting according to document examiners, would become the foundation of the prosecution's case and the verbal trap that would eventually break Brian during his interrogation. Beyond the notebook, investigators discovered dozens of text messages between Brian and Lisa, discussing their frustration with both sets of parents for imposing strict limitations on their relationship, including a particularly disturbing exchange from 3 weeks before the murders. "I wish they would all just disappear," Brian had written, to which Lisa had responded, "We don't need to wish anymore, we just need to act." These digital breadcrumbs, combined with the physical evidence and the notebook's detailed plans, painted a picture not of impulsive teenage violence, but of a calculated murder plot driven by a disturbing mutual obsession that viewed eliminating their parents as the solution to maintaining their relationship. Detective Noah Roberts stood at the edge of the Ferryman property, watching the forensic team document blood spatter patterns in what should have been a peaceful master bedroom in one of Aspen's most prestigious neighborhoods. The veteran detective had worked homicides for 15 years, including 3 years with Denver's Major Crimes Unit, before relocating to what he had expected would be the quieter environment of a resort town. Aspen's wealth usually insulated it from the kind of violence he'd seen in the city. Domestic disputes here typically ended in expensive divorces, not murder. The methodical execution of Everett and Marisol Ferryman, however, showed planning that was rare, even in his urban cases. No signs of struggle, precise gunshot wounds, and an unsettlingly thorough cleanup attempt that suggested the perpetrator had researched forensic countermeasures. "The powder burns indicate close-range shots less than 12 inches, explained the medical examiner, pointing to the wounds on Everett Ferryman's temple. "Based on liver temperature and rigor, I'd place time of death between 2 and 3:30 a.m. Saturday morning. Similar pattern on the wife. She never woke up either." Roberts nodded, noting that the Tolbert crime scene had yielded nearly identical findings for Victor Tolbert, though Nadine appeared to have been awake and possibly confronted her killer in the kitchen before being shot twice in the chest rather than the head. The lack of defensive wounds on any victim and absence of signs of forced entry supported the developing theory that the killer was known to both families, a theory that had quickly focused on the missing teenagers once officers learned of their relationship and recent conflicts with their parents. The breakthrough came Tuesday morning when Robert's phone rang with a call from Sarah Winters, the guidance counselor at Aspen Heights Academy, the private school where both teens had been honor students. "Detective, I was asked to check Lisa Tolbert's locker for any medications or personal items that might need securing, she explained, her voice tense with what Roberts recognized as the discomfort of someone who had discovered something they wished they hadn't. I found a notebook that, well, I think you need to see it immediately. Within 30 minutes, Roberts was sitting in the counselor's office, wearing gloves as he carefully turned the pages of a seemingly ordinary spiral notebook that had been hidden beneath textbooks and school supplies in Lisa's locker. The first 2/3 contained what one would expect from a high-achieving student: chemistry equations, annotations from English literature readings, and notes about college application deadlines. But past page 47, the content shifted dramatically to what could only be described as surveillance documentation on both the Ferryman and Tolbert households, detailed notes on everyone's schedules, habits, and vulnerabilities. Dad takes Ambien at 10:15, unconscious by 10:40, read one entry about Victor Tolbert, while another noted, EF charges phone downstairs, never brings it to bedroom. Other pages contained crude but functional diagrams of both homes' layouts, with routes marked between bedrooms, apparently tracking the most efficient path for moving between victims. The final pages contained bullet-pointed task lists, including disable outdoor cameras, wear shoes 2 sizes too large, and 45 minutes maximum total for both houses, suggesting a level of planning that chilled even the experienced detective. What caught Roberts's immediate attention, however, was the phrase that appeared twice on the final page, circled and underlined with emphasis: after Saturday, nothing stands in our way. The timeline suddenly crystallized. The murders had occurred in the early hours of Saturday, September 14th. Whatever had stood in their way in the minds of these teenagers had been permanently removed according to their timetable. Roberts immediately called the prosecutor assigned to the case, Charlotte Phillips, who arrived at the school within minutes to view the evidence herself before it was carefully bagged for processing. This is premeditation documented in their own words, Phillips said, her experienced prosecutor's eye immediately grasping the significance. But we need to establish connection, prove Lisa showed this to Brian, or that he contributed to it. The detective agreed, knowing that while the notebook was compelling, it would be even more powerful if they could demonstrate shared knowledge of its contents. Roberts decided that the phrase, after Saturday, nothing stands in our way, would become central to his interrogation strategy, a verbal tripwire he would carefully deploy to determine whether Brian was familiar with Lisa's writings. While the forensic team continued processing both crime scenes, another detective interviewed friends and teachers of the teenage couple, building a picture of their relationship and the growing tensions with their parents. The pattern that emerged was troublingly consistent. What had begun as a typical high school romance had, over 9 months, transformed into what one teacher described as concerning codependency. Both sets of parents had apparently recognized warning signs in the relationship's intensity. According to Marisol Ferryman's sister, who had been in close contact with her in the weeks before the murders, both families had independently decided to implement stricter boundaries, including monitored communication, earlier curfews, and discussions about sending the teens to separate schools for their final year. Victor Tolbert's colleague at the hospital reported that Victor had expressed concern about unhealthy attachment patterns he'd observed between the teens and had consulted with a child psychologist about intervention strategies. The teens' friends painted a picture of increasing isolation as Brian and Lisa withdrew from other social connections to focus exclusively on each other. They stopped hanging out with anyone else around April, reported Emma Lawson, previously Lisa's closest friend. Lisa would cancel plans if Brian texted, and she started saying weird things about how no one understood what they had together. Another classmate described overhearing Lisa telling Brian that our parents are the enemy after Nadine Tolbert had confiscated Lisa's phone for a weekend following a missed curfew. The school's records showed that both teens' academic performance had begun to suffer in the final quarter of the previous school year, with uncharacteristic absences and incomplete assignments that had prompted concerned emails from teachers to both sets of parents. Detective Roberts compiled all this background information as he prepared for what he anticipated would be challenging interrogations. He had interviewed enough teenagers to know that their perception of reality, particularly regarding relationships and authority, often differed dramatically from adults. But the level of calculation evident in the notebook suggested something beyond typical teenage rebellion or even ordinary crimes of passion. With the murder weapon recovered and preliminary forensic evidence placing both teens at both crime scenes, Roberts knew that establishing the psychological dynamics between Brian and Lisa would be crucial for the prosecution. Were they equal partners in planning the murders, or had one led while the other followed? While Roberts prepared his interview strategy, digital forensic specialists worked through the teens' phones, laptops, and social media accounts, uncovering messages that revealed escalating resentment toward their parents. "They're trying to destroy us," Brian had written to Lisa 3 weeks before the murders. "My mom went through my room again and found the letters you wrote me. They don't understand what we have is forever." Lisa's responses showed a pattern of intensifying the emotional stakes. "They'll never stop until we're completely apart. They'll send us to different states if they have to. We need to take control." The exchanges grew increasingly explicit about considering dramatic action, culminating in a message from Lisa sent 5 days before the murders. "The plan is perfect. No more interference, no more separation. Just us. Forever." With search warrants executed on both teens' bedrooms, investigators discovered additional evidence of premeditation. Hidden in Brian's closet beneath winter clothing was a hand-drawn map of both neighborhoods with timing notations and paths marked between houses. Lisa's bedroom yielded a more disturbing find, a collection of newspaper articles about teens who had killed their parents, carefully clipped and stored in a folder labeled Research. Most tellingly, investigators found browser histories on both teens' computers, showing searches for topics including gunshot wound fatality rates, how to disable security cameras, and states with most lenient juvenile murder sentences. The digital trail confirmed what the notebook had suggested. The quadruple homicide had been researched and planned over at least 3 weeks, not committed in a moment of passion or impulse. By Wednesday afternoon, 72 hours after the bodies were discovered, Detective Roberts had assembled a case file that documented not only the forensic evidence connecting both teens to both crime scenes, but also a comprehensive psychological profile of a relationship that had morphed into a dangerous folie à deux. The recovered notebook, with its incriminating phrase, "After Saturday, nothing stands in our way," would serve as both physical evidence and interrogation tool as Roberts prepared to question the teens separately at the juvenile detention facility where they were being held. Based on his observations of their interactions during the arrest and processing, Roberts had made a strategic decision. He would interview Brian first, sensing that the younger teen might be more vulnerable to breaking down under questioning, particularly if he believed Lisa might be implicating him. The juvenile detention facility's interview room had been deliberately designed to feel less intimidating than its adult counterpart. The table and chairs were standard office furniture rather than bolted-down institutional metal, and the walls were painted a neutral beige instead of institutional gray. Detective Noah Roberts, however, knew that these cosmetic differences did little to change the fundamental psychological dynamics of an interrogation, especially one involving homicide charges. He arranged the case files carefully on the table, placing the evidence bag containing Lisa's notebook in plain sight but still sealed. its contents not immediately visible to the suspect. Brian Ferryman entered the room in detention-issued clothing, looking younger than his 16 years without the carefully curated wardrobe his Instagram account had showcased. "Brian, I'm Detective Roberts," he began, keeping his tone professional but not harsh. "I've advised your appointed attorney that we're conducting this interview, and she has chosen to wait outside. You can stop answering questions or ask for her at any point, understood?" The teenager nodded, his eyes repeatedly darting to the evidence bag on the table while he maintained what Roberts recognized as a practiced expression of calm. "We're investigating the deaths of your parents, Everett and Marisol Ferryman, as well as Lisa's parents, Nadine and Victor Tolbert," Roberts continued, watching closely for emotional reactions as he mentioned each name. Brian's face remained composed, almost blank, a response that immediately struck Roberts as unnatural compared to the typical shock, grief, or even defensive anger he usually observed when interviewing family members of homicide victims. "Can you tell me where you were between midnight and 4 a.m. on Saturday, September 14th? Roberts asked, beginning with basic timeline questions while establishing a conversational rhythm. Brian's response came with rehearsed precision. "Lisa and I left Aspen around 8 p.m. Friday night. We drove to Grand Junction and got a motel room because we needed to get away from our parents for the weekend." The story continued with specific details about stops they had made for gas and snacks, the motel check-in process, and what they had watched on television. Details that Roberts recognized as an attempt to construct an alibi through excessive specificity. "That's interesting, Brian, because we have security camera footage from your neighbor's house showing someone matching your description entering your home at 1:47 a.m. on Saturday," Roberts stated calmly, watching as the first flicker of uncertainty crossed the teen's face. This was not technically accurate. The footage showed a hooded figure whose height and build were consistent with Brian's, but the face wasn't visible. But it was a standard investigative technique to present ambiguous evidence as more definitive. Brian's composure slipped momentarily before he countered, "That's impossible. We were already in Grand Junction by then. Maybe it was someone who looks like me." Roberts nodded, as if considering this explanation, then shifted tactics. "Let's talk about your relationship with Lisa. I understand both your parents and hers had concerns about how much time you were spending together." This prompted the first genuine emotional response. A flash of anger crossed Brian's face as he leaned forward. "They were trying to keep us apart. They didn't understand what we have together. My parents threatened to send me to boarding school in Connecticut, and Lisa's dad was looking at schools in California. They were trying to separate us permanently." For the next 30 minutes, Roberts let Brian talk about the relationship, the perceived interference from parents, and the growing restrictions both families had implemented. The detective noted how Brian repeatedly used phrases like, "Lisa and I decided," and "we knew what we had to do," unconsciously revealing a shared decision-making pattern while still maintaining their alibi claim. Roberts deliberately avoided direct accusations, instead building rapport while gathering background that would prove useful in contextualizing the evidence. Throughout this portion of the interview, Brian appeared increasingly comfortable, even confident, occasionally glancing at the evidence bag, but seeming less concerned about its contents as the conversation progressed. Having established this baseline, Roberts abruptly changed direction. "Brian, we've spoken with several of your and Lisa's classmates. They've told us that you two had been talking about getting rid of the interference for weeks before your parents were killed." The teen's posture stiffened, his eyes narrowing slightly. "That's not true. We were just venting. Everybody complains about their parents." Roberts nodded sympathetically before continuing, "That's what I thought too, until we found something interesting." With deliberate slowness, Roberts opened the evidence bag and removed Lisa's notebook, placing it on the table, but not yet opening it. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, watching, as Brian's eyes fixed on the familiar spiral binding and blue cover. "It looks like a school notebook. Lots of people have those," Brian answered, his voice slightly higher than it had been moments before. "This one belongs to Lisa," Roberts explained, opening the notebook to the middle section containing ordinary school notes. "See, her chemistry notes, English class assignments." Brian visibly relaxed, perhaps believing the notebook contained nothing incriminating until Roberts turned to the later pages. "But then we found these entries," he continued, turning to reveal the surveillance notes on both families' routines. "And this is what really caught my attention," he added, flipping to the final page with the circled phrase, "After Saturday, nothing stands in our way." The detective watched closely as Brian's eyes widened momentarily before he controlled his expression. "I've never seen that before," Brian stated flatly, but Roberts noted the subtle changes in his body language, increased blinking, a slight tremor in his right hand, shifting position in his chair. "That's strange," Roberts replied conversationally, "because Lisa's fingerprints are all over these pages, and this particular phrase seems very significant. Saturday was the day your parents and hers were killed. What exactly was standing in your way, Brian?" The teenager maintained eye contact, but his breathing had quickened. "I don't know what that means. I've never seen that notebook before. Maybe someone is trying to set us up." Roberts allowed silence to fill the room for several uncomfortable seconds before continuing. "Brian, we've executed search warrants on both your bedroom and Lisa's. We've found some interesting things, maps, research materials, browser histories, showing searches for things like how to make a murder look like a break-in. Can you explain those?" This was another tactical exaggeration. They had found maps and disturbing research, but not the specific search terms he mentioned. Brian's face had paled, but he maintained his denial. "I don't know anything about that. I want to talk to my lawyer." Recognizing that direct confrontation was hardening Brian's resistance, Roberts nodded and shifted to a more empathetic approach. "I understand this is difficult. You're 16 years old, facing an incredibly serious situation. The evidence we have so far suggests that what happened wasn't entirely your idea." This subtle suggestion that Roberts believed Lisa might have been the driving force was calculated to appeal to Brian's sense of self-preservation. Sometimes people get pulled into situations by someone they care about, someone perhaps more dominant in the relationship. The strategic implication that Lisa might be placing blame on Brian had its intended effect. "Lisa wouldn't say that," he responded immediately, defensiveness evident in his tone. "We made all our decisions together." Roberts noticed the shift from "I don't know anything about it" to "we made all our decisions together," a critical slip that he would build upon. "So you were equal partners in everything, including what happened on Saturday?" Brian caught himself, realizing his error. "I didn't say anything happened. We weren't even there." Roberts nodded thoughtfully before placing a transcript on the table, another calculated move. "This is from our interview with Lisa yesterday." This was false. Lisa had not yet been interviewed, but Roberts was testing whether Brian's loyalty would withstand the belief that Lisa might be cooperating with authorities. "She had quite a lot to say about the planning that went into Saturday morning." The color drained from Brian's face as he stared at the document, which was actually an unrelated case transcript with similar formatting. "She wouldn't," he whispered, more to himself than to the detective. Roberts pressed the advantage, turning back to the notebook. "Lisa was very specific about this phrase. After Saturday, nothing stands in our way. She explained exactly what it meant to the two of you." This was the moment when Brian made the critical error that would significantly impact both teens' cases. "She's lying about what it meant," he blurted, then immediately realized his mistake. The phrase, "she's lying about what it meant," inherently acknowledged that he knew what the phrase was and that it had meaning to him, directly contradicting his earlier claim of never having seen the notebook before. Roberts kept his expression neutral despite recognizing the significance of this slip. Oh? What was she lying about specifically? Brian's composure crumbled visibly as he recognized the trap he had fallen into. "I want my lawyer now," he stated firmly, but the damage was already done. "That's your right," Roberts acknowledged, gathering the materials while deliberately leaving the notebook open to the incriminating page. "We'll continue this conversation later." As he prepared to leave the room, he added casually, "By the way, we haven't actually interviewed Lisa yet, but it's interesting that you seemed concerned about what she might say." The detective left Brian alone in the interview room, instructing the recording equipment to continue running to capture any spontaneous utterances or body language in the minutes following the interrogation. Through the observation window, Roberts watched as the teenager stared at the notebook, then put his head in his hands. The recording would later capture Brian's whispered words to himself. "She said no one would find it. She promised we had covered everything." This unguarded moment, combined with his earlier slip acknowledging awareness of the notebook's contents, would become crucial evidence that both teens had knowledge of the planning documented in those pages. After conferring with prosecutor Charlotte Phillips, who had been observing the interview, Roberts prepared for his next challenge, interrogating Lisa Tolbert. Based on Brian's reactions and the evidence they had gathered, both the detective and prosecutor anticipated that Lisa would present a more controlled, strategic front during questioning. The notebook had proven an effective tool for breaking through Brian's initial denials, but they suspected Lisa would require a different approach. The dynamics between the teenage couple were becoming clearer. While both appeared to have been active participants in planning the murders, Lisa showed signs of being the more calculating partner, with Brian following her lead, but potentially more vulnerable to emotional manipulation, both by Lisa and by investigators. "Let's use what we've learned from Brian without revealing exactly what he said," Phillips advised as they reviewed the interview recording. "She'll be wondering how he handled the questioning. If we suggest he's cooperating without being specific, we might be able to create the same kind of uncertainty." Roberts agreed, making notes for his approach to Lisa's interview scheduled for the following morning. The evidence was accumulating rapidly, but the psychological dimension of the case, understanding how two teenagers had rationalized the murder of their parents as a solution to relationship restrictions, remained the most disturbing and complex aspect of the investigation. Lisa Tolbert sat perfectly straight in the same interview room where Brian had been questioned the previous day, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, hands folded calmly on the table before her. Unlike Brian, whose body language had betrayed anxiety despite his attempts at composure, Lisa projected a preternatural calm that Detective Roberts had rarely observed in suspects of any age, let alone a 17-year-old facing quadruple murder charges. Her court-appointed attorney, Marjorie Downs, sat beside her, having opted to be present throughout the interview rather than waiting outside, as Brian's lawyer had done. "Ms. Tolbert understands her rights and is willing to answer basic questions," the attorney stated, "though we reserve the right to terminate this interview at any point." Roberts nodded acknowledgement, while noting Lisa's steady gaze, which tracked his movements with analytical precision rather than the emotional reactivity most suspects displayed. "Lisa, I'd like to start by establishing your whereabouts between Friday evening, September 13th, and Sunday morning when you and Brian were located in Grand Junction," he began, using the same opening approach he had used with Brian. Lisa's response came in a measured, almost rehearsed cadence. "Brian picked me up around 8 p.m. on Friday. We decided to go to Grand Junction for the weekend to have some space from our parents. We checked into the Pinewood Motel around 11 p.m. and stayed in our room until the police arrived on Sunday." The account matched Brian's initial statement almost verbatim, a consistency that Roberts recognized as potentially indicating a pre-agreed narrative rather than independent recollection. "That's interesting," he commented, "because we have cell tower data showing your phone connecting to towers in Aspen until approximately 3 a.m. on Saturday morning." Lisa didn't flinch at this revelation, which was actually true, unlike some of the tactical assertions he had made to Brian. "We left our phones at home," she countered smoothly. "We were trying to disconnect completely for the weekend, get away from everyone tracking us." "By everyone tracking us, you mean your parents?" Roberts asked, watching for emotional reactions to the mention of the victims. "Yes," Lisa confirmed without hesitation or visible discomfort. "They were increasingly controlling our relationship. My father had threatened to send me to boarding school in California to separate me from Brian." Roberts nodded sympathetically, employing the same rapport-building approach he had used with Brian. "That must have been frustrating. How long had your relationship with Brian been causing tension with your parents?" For the next 20 minutes, Lisa detailed the escalating restrictions both sets of parents had implemented: monitoring of text messages, enforced curfews, limited contact during school hours, and eventually the threats of separation through different schools. Unlike Brian, whose anger had surfaced quickly when discussing parental interference, Lisa maintained an almost clinical detachment, presenting the information as if reporting objective facts rather than emotionally charged personal experiences. Her attorney occasionally placed a cautioning hand on her arm when questions veered toward establishing motive, but Lisa appeared unbothered, continuing her narrative with composed precision. "Let's talk about what we found in your locker at school," Roberts transitioned, placing the now familiar notebook on the table between them. Unlike Brian, whose eyes had immediately fixed on the notebook with visible concern, Lisa glanced at it briefly before returning her gaze to the detective's face. "That appears to be a school notebook," she stated neutrally, neither confirming nor denying ownership. "It's your notebook, Lisa," Roberts clarified. "Your fingerprints are on every page, and your guidance counselor identified it as coming from your locker during a safety inspection." Lisa nodded once, as if acknowledging a minor point. "I have several notebooks for different subjects. May I ask what specifically interests you about this one?" The calculated response, neither denying ownership nor expressing concern about its contents, confirmed Roberts' assessment that Lisa would present a more formidable interrogation challenge than Brian had. "What interests me," he replied, opening the notebook to the pages containing surveillance notes on both families, "are these detailed observations about your parents' and Brian's parents' routines, sleep habits, and security practices." For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed Lisa's face, not fear or guilt, but something closer to annoyance, quickly suppressed. "I wasn't aware that taking notes was a crime, Detective," she responded, her voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "I'm a habitual note-taker. It helps me process information." Her attorney interjected, "Detective, if you're suggesting these notes indicate premeditation for some crime, we're getting into territory where I'd advise my client not to respond further without formal charges being filed." Roberts acknowledged the attorney with a nod, but kept his focus on Lisa. "I'm particularly interested in this phrase," he continued, turning to the final page with its emphasized statement. "After Saturday, nothing stands in our way." Lisa studied the page for several seconds, her expression unreadable. "It sounds like a motivational note to myself about weekend plans," she offered, maintaining eye contact with Roberts rather than looking away as most people do when constructing a false explanation. "What plans were those exactly?" Roberts pressed, leaning forward slightly. "What was standing in your way that would no longer be an obstacle after Saturday?" Lisa glanced at her attorney, who gave a subtle nod indicating she could answer. "Brian and I had been discussing ways to handle our parents' interference in our relationship," she stated carefully. We considered various options: legal emancipation, waiting until graduation, even just improved communication strategies. The note likely referred to having a discussion with them that weekend to establish better boundaries. The calculated ambiguity of her explanation was impressive, acknowledging that parental interference was an issue while offering an innocuous interpretation of the phrase that had so disturbed investigators. Roberts maintained a neutral expression, shifting to his next tactic. "We've spoken extensively with Brian about the events of that weekend," he stated, watching carefully for her reaction. Unlike Brian's immediate concern at the mention of his girlfriend potentially cooperating with authorities, Lisa's only response was a slight narrowing of her eyes. "Has he?" she asked, her tone revealing nothing beyond mild curiosity. "And what did Brian have to say?" The question itself was revealing, not asking what Brian had been asked or what topics had been discussed, but specifically what he had said, suggesting concern about what information he might have shared. Roberts recognized the opportunity to exploit this subtle tell. "Brian was quite forthcoming once we showed him certain evidence. He seemed quite concerned about what you might have already told us." It was a deliberate mirror of the tactic he had used with Brian, suggesting the other partner was cooperating without providing specific details. Lisa's response, however, differed dramatically from Brian's emotional reaction. "I'm glad Brian is cooperating," she said with what appeared to be genuine calm, "though I'm curious what evidence you're referring to that would connect either of us to whatever happened to our parents." The phrasing, "whatever happened to our parents," rather than "our parents' murders," struck Roberts as a distancing technique, avoiding direct acknowledgement of the killings. "We have physical evidence placing both of you at both crime scenes during the time frame when the murders occurred," he stated, which was partially true. They had forensic evidence connecting the teens to both houses, though not definitively within the exact murder time frame. "Additionally, we've recovered the murder weapon with both your fingerprints present." Lisa's attorney stiffened slightly at this information, but Lisa herself maintained her composure. "Detective, what exactly is it that Brian told you?" she asked directly, returning to her earlier concern. "Has he made specific allegations against me?" The question revealed what Roberts had suspected. Lisa's primary concern was not the evidence itself, but what Brian might have said about her role versus his. It suggested potential vulnerability in their unified front, a crack he could potentially exploit. "I think what's most important right now is understanding your perspective, Lisa," Roberts deflected, not wanting to reveal that Brian had accidentally acknowledged awareness of the notebook's contents. "For instance, can you explain why your research on your laptop included searches for topics like juvenile murder sentencing and gunshot wound fatality rates?" This information was accurate. The digital forensics team had recovered these searches from Lisa's computer even after she had attempted to delete her browser history. For the first time, Lisa's confident facade showed signs of strain, a momentary tightening around her eyes, a slight flush rising on her neck. Her attorney immediately intervened. "Detective, are you formally accusing my client of involvement in her parents' deaths? If so, we should terminate this interview and proceed with proper charging documents." Roberts maintained his focus on Lisa, who had recovered her composure, but was now sitting slightly more rigidly than before. "I'm simply trying to understand why a 17-year-old honors student would be researching those particular topics in the weeks before her parents were murdered." Lisa leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a colder quality than it had previously. "Detective Roberts, I understand you're doing your job, but I think I've been very cooperative in answering your questions about my whereabouts and relationship with my parents. If you're now suggesting I had something to do with their deaths, I believe I should follow my attorney's advice and end this interview." The calm calculation in her tone, weighing cooperation against self-protection, reinforced Roberts's impression of her as the more strategic of the two teens. Before Roberts could respond, Lisa asked the question that would become central to the prosecution's later characterization of her role. How much has Brian already told you exactly? The specific wording, not asking if Brian had implicated her or what evidence they had, but precisely how much information Brian had provided, suggested she was mentally calculating what might already be compromised versus what she could still control. Roberts noted this telling formulation but kept his response deliberately vague. Brian has provided us with his perspective on the events leading up to Saturday morning. There are some inconsistencies we're hoping you can help clarify. Lisa maintained eye contact for several long seconds before turning to her attorney. I think I've answered enough questions for today, she stated firmly. As her attorney began gathering her papers in preparation to leave, Lisa added what appeared to be an afterthought, but which Roberts recognized as a carefully placed statement. Detective, I hope you're considering the possibility that Brian's story might not be entirely reliable. He can be very emotional and easily influenced. The calculated attempt to undermine Brian's credibility, planting seeds of doubt about his reliability while presenting herself as the rational, composed party, confirmed what the evidence had already suggested to Roberts. While both teens appeared to have been active participants in planning and executing the murders, Lisa displayed a level of psychological manipulation and strategic thinking that suggested she may have been the driving force behind the crimes. As Lisa and her attorney stood to leave, Roberts made one final observation. It's interesting, Lisa, that throughout this entire conversation about the violent deaths of your parents and Brian's, you haven't asked a single question about how they died, expressed any grief, or shown any emotion about their loss. For the first time, genuine surprise flickered across Lisa's face, not guilt or sorrow, but what appeared to be annoyance at having made such an obvious oversight in her performance. I'm still in shock, Detective, she recovered quickly, her voice taking on a practiced quality of subdued grief. Everyone processes trauma differently. My therapist has always said, I tend to intellectualize emotional situations. The belated explanation, coming only after the omission had been pointed out, struck Roberts as further evidence of calculation rather than authentic emotional processing. As Lisa was escorted from the interview room, Roberts compared mental notes on the two interrogations. Brian had started with confident denial, but quickly crumbled under pressure, making critical errors that revealed his knowledge of the planning documented in the notebook. Lisa, by contrast, had maintained composure throughout, revealing little beyond what she chose to disclose, with her only significant tell being her repeated concern about what Brian might have already told investigators. The contrasting interrogation styles would later feature prominently in prosecutor Charlotte Phillips's case presentation, with Brian characterized as the emotionally driven, manipulated partner and Lisa as the calculating architect of the murder plot, a dynamic that their respective attorneys would vigorously contest, creating one of the central tensions of the upcoming legal proceedings. The Pitkin County Courthouse stood as an incongruous blend of historic architecture and modern security measures, its 19th-century facade now augmented with metal detectors and surveillance cameras necessitated by the national media attention the case had attracted. 3 weeks after the murders of the Ferryman and Tolbert parents, the preliminary hearing began with unusual arrangements reflecting the defendants' ages and the case's high profile. Judge Eleanor Hartman had ordered limited media access, no cameras in the courtroom, with only print journalists permitted to observe, and had the proceedings moved to the largest available courtroom to accommodate the extended families of the victims and the legal teams for both defendants. Prosecutor Charlotte Phillips entered the courtroom with purposeful strides, her reputation as Pitkin County's most formidable litigator evident in the respectful silence that followed her progress to the prosecution table. At 42, Phillips had tried 17 homicide cases with 16 convictions, specializing in cases involving complex psychological dynamics rather than straightforward evidence. Her decision to prosecute the Ferryman Tolbert case personally, rather than assigning it to a junior prosecutor, despite the defendants being juveniles, signaled the gravity with which the district attorney's office viewed the crimes, and perhaps Phillips's recognition that this case could define her career. The defense tables presented a stark visual contrast that would persist throughout the proceedings. Brian. Ferryman sat hunched beside his attorney, Martha Livingston, a public defender who specialized in juvenile cases, his gaze fixed downward and his body language radiating vulnerability. Across the aisle, Lisa Tolbert sat with perfect posture next to Warren Schiff, a private attorney whose services were being funded by a trust established by her late parents, her expression composed and attentive as she surveyed the courtroom with analytical detachment. The seating arrangement itself, separate tables with their attorneys forming a physical barrier between the teenage couple, visualized what would become a central theme of the case: the severed unity of two young people who had allegedly killed to preserve their connection. The state of Colorado versus Brian Ferryman and Lisa Tolbert, announced the bailiff as Judge Hartman entered and took her seat at the bench, her experienced eyes taking in the courtroom's tense atmosphere. This preliminary hearing will determine if sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial on 4 counts of first-degree murder with deliberation, 4 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 counts of first-degree burglary. The legal machinery had moved with unusual speed, with the district attorney's office making the controversial decision to charge both teens as adults despite their ages, a decision that had sparked heated debate in legal circles but had been preliminarily upheld by Judge Hartman pending the outcome of this hearing. Prosecutor Phillips rose for her opening statement, adjusting her glasses in a characteristic gesture that courtroom regulars recognized as her transition into battle mode. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Brian Ferryman and Lisa Tolbert committed the premeditated murders of Everett and Marisol Ferryman and Victor and Nadine Tolbert in a calculated effort to eliminate what they perceived as the only obstacle to their relationship: parental authority. Her voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom as she continued, "This was not impulsive teenage rebellion taken to a tragic extreme. This was not a crime of passion or momentary rage. This was a meticulously planned execution of 4 adults whose only offense was attempting to set appropriate boundaries for their children." Phillips methodically outlined the state's case, beginning with the discovery of the bodies and the initial timeline established through forensic evidence. She described the motel room where the teens were found, emphasizing their apparent lack of distress or confusion when apprehended. When tactical officers entered their room with weapons drawn, neither defendant asked what was happening or expressed concern about their parents, she noted, because they already knew exactly what had happened to their parents. They had planned and executed their murders approximately 30 hours earlier. The prosecutor then introduced what would become known as the central piece of physical evidence, Lisa's notebook with its damning final phrase, "After Saturday, nothing stands in our way." Phillips held up an enlarged photograph of the page, the circled and underlined words clearly visible even from the back of the courtroom. The defendant's own documentation provides irrefutable evidence of premeditation, Your Honor. Saturday, September 14th, was the date they selected for removing the obstacles in their path, their parents. Phillips then detailed the forensic evidence connecting both teens to both crime scenes: gunshot residue on clothing found in their possession, DNA evidence linking them to the murder weapon, and cell phone location data contradicting their alibi claim of having left Aspen the previous evening. Most damning, Your Honor, are the defendant's own words, not just those written in the planning notebook, but those captured during their interrogations. Here, Phillips introduced the transcript of Brian's critical slip during questioning, where he had inadvertently revealed knowledge of the notebook's contents by claiming Lisa was lying about what it meant, rather than maintaining his earlier denial of ever having seen it. What the evidence reveals, Phillips continued, her voice taking on additional gravity, is a disturbing dynamic between these two young people, a relationship that became so obsessive that the elimination of parental authority through murder appeared to them a reasonable solution to restrictions on their time together. She then outlined the state's theory of distinct but complementary roles in the crime. The evidence will show that Lisa Tolbert was the primary architect of the murder plot, meticulously researching methods, documenting plans, and strategizing to minimize evidence, while Brian Ferryman served as the willing executor, translating those plans into deadly action. Phillips concluded her opening statement by addressing the defendant's age directly, anticipating what would become a central element of both defense strategies. Your Honor, the state acknowledges that these defendants are chronologically teenagers, but the level of calculation evident in their actions, the research into forensic countermeasures, the planning of multiple murders across 2 locations, the creation of alibis, and the cold-blooded execution of sleeping victims demonstrates a level of criminal sophistication that demands they be held fully accountable as adults under the law. As Phillips returned to her seat, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of the allegations settling heavily on all present. Judge Hartman turned her attention to the defense tables, where Martha Livingston rose first to present the opening statement for Brian Ferryman. From the outset, Livingston established what would become Brian's core defense, diminished capacity through emotional manipulation. Your Honor, the evidence will indeed show planning and calculation, but will demonstrate that this planning originated with and was directed by Lisa Tolbert, who exercised extraordinary psychological control over my client. Livingston portrayed Brian as a vulnerable teen who had become emotionally dependent on Lisa to a degree that compromised his judgment and autonomy. The notebook at the center of the prosecution's case bears only Lisa Tolbert's handwriting and fingerprints, not Brian's, she emphasized. The computer searches for murder methods and forensic countermeasures were conducted on Lisa's devices, not Brian's. The public defender carefully navigated a difficult strategy, acknowledging Brian's likely involvement while characterizing it as the result of manipulation rather than equal partnership. The evidence will show that Brian Ferryman was not the architect of this tragedy, but rather its second victim, a teenager whose emotional vulnerability was exploited by someone with a disturbing capacity for manipulation. When Warren Schiff rose to present Lisa Tolbert's defense, he employed a dramatically different approach that reflected his client's composed demeanor. Rather than claiming manipulation or diminished capacity, Schiff directly attacked the evidence itself. Your Honor, the prosecution has presented a compelling narrative, but one built primarily on circumstantial evidence and creative interpretation rather than direct proof of my client's involvement. He systematically challenged each element of Phillips's opening, arguing that the notebook represented typical teenage venting rather than actual planning, that the recovered weapon bore inconclusive fingerprints that could have been left during normal household contact, and that cell phone location data was notoriously unreliable for precise positioning. Most strikingly, Schiff introduced what would become a central element of Lisa's defense, the argument that Brian had acted independently out of obsessive attachment, and that Lisa had neither encouraged nor participated in the actual killings. The evidence will show that Brian Ferryman's emotional instability and growing resentment toward both sets of parents created a powder keg that Lisa was neither responsible for nor capable of controlling, Schiff argued. My client's only mistake was failing to recognize the depth of Brian's disturbance and failing to alert authorities to his increasingly troubling statements about removing obstacles to their relationship. The strategy created the extraordinary spectacle of both defense teams effectively positioning the defendants against each other, with Brian's attorney portraying him as manipulated by Lisa, while Lisa's attorney characterized Brian as unstable and acting independently. This dynamic of mutual accusation, which Phillips would later describe as a perfect demonstration of how quickly their unbreakable bond dissolved when self-preservation became paramount, established the psychological battleground on which much of the case would be fought. Judge Hartman observed these opening statements with the impassivity developed over 23 years on the bench, interrupting only once when Schiff's characterization of Brian verged on potentially prejudicial language. As the opening statements concluded, she announced, "We will proceed with witness testimony, beginning with the prosecution's case. I remind all present that this preliminary hearing's purpose is to determine if sufficient evidence exists to proceed to trial, not to establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt." The first witness called was Detective Noah Roberts, who provided a comprehensive overview of the initial investigation, crime scene findings, and evidence recovery. Under Phillips's methodical questioning, Roberts described the condition of the victims' bodies, the forensic evidence indicating the murders occurred while most victims were sleeping, and the recovery of the murder weapon from a dumpster along the route to Grand Junction. When Phillips asked about the teen's demeanor upon arrest, Roberts testified, "In my 23 years of law enforcement, I've never encountered suspects who showed less emotional reaction to being apprehended for the murder of their parents. There was no crying, no confusion, no asking what had happened to their families, just calculated questions about legal representation." Phillips then guided Roberts through the discovery of Lisa's notebook, projecting photographs of key pages on the courtroom's evidence screen. The detective explained how the school counselor had found the notebook during a routine safety inspection of Lisa's locker, and how its contents had immediately triggered her concern. As Roberts read aloud from the surveillance notes detailing the victim's bedtime routines, sleep medication usage, and vulnerable moments, family members in the gallery could be heard softly weeping. The most dramatic moment came when Phillips asked Roberts to read the circled phrase that had become central to the case. "After Saturday, nothing stands in our way." "Detective Roberts," Phillips inquired, "in your professional assessment, what does this phrase indicate about the defendant's intentions?" Before Roberts could answer, both defense attorneys objected simultaneously, arguing the question called for speculation beyond the detective's expertise. Judge Hartman sustained the objection, but allowed Phillips to rephrase, "Detective, based on your investigation, what event occurred on Saturday, September 14th, that corresponds to this written statement?" "The murders of all four parents occurred in the early morning hours of Saturday, September 14th, Roberts replied. "Based on our timeline reconstructed from forensic evidence, the first victims, Everett and Marisol Ferryman, were killed between approximately 2 and 2:45 a.m., and Nadine and Victor Tolbert were killed between approximately 3 and 3:30 a.m. The clinical precision of the timeline, juxtaposed with the notebook's ominous phrase about removing obstacles, created a powerful narrative, a connection that visibly impacted the courtroom observers, including several jurors who would likely serve in the eventual trial. Phillips then directed Roberts to the interrogations, playing selected audio excerpts, including Brian's critical slip, acknowledging familiarity with the notebook's contents despite his earlier denial. The contrast between Brian's increasingly emotional responses during questioning and Lisa's composed, strategic interaction with investigators was striking when presented in sequential excerpts. Phillips concluded her direct examination by asking Roberts about additional evidence recovered from the teens' bedrooms and devices. Roberts testified about the browser history revealing research into murder methods, forensic countermeasures, and juvenile sentencing guidelines, as well as the maps and timing notations found in Bryan's possession. When cross-examination began, the divergent defense strategies became even more apparent. Martha Livingston, representing Bryan, focused her questions on establishing Lisa's dominant role in the relationship, having Roberts confirm that the handwriting in the notebook was exclusively Lisa's and that the most incriminating computer searches had been conducted on her devices. Livingston carefully avoided questioning that might further incriminate her client while attempting to shift primary responsibility toward Lisa. Detective Roberts, in your observation of the defendants during arrest and processing, who appeared to be taking the lead in decision-making? She asked. Lisa Tolbert consistently appeared to be the more composed, strategic individual, Roberts acknowledged. She was the first to ask for legal representation, specified that they should have separate attorneys, and appeared to be monitoring Bryan's responses to determine what he might be sharing with investigators. Livingston nodded satisfaction with this response, which supported her portrait of Bryan as the influenced rather than the influencer. Warren Schiff's cross-examination took a dramatically different approach, aggressively challenging Roberts on the evidence connecting Lisa directly to the physical acts of murder. Detective, you've testified about this notebook and various computer searches, but can you point to any physical evidence? Fingerprints on the murder weapon, DNA, or eyewitness testimony that places my client at either crime scene at the time of the killings? Roberts acknowledged that while circumstantial evidence strongly suggested both teens' presence, they had not recovered direct physical evidence specifically linking Lisa to pulling the trigger. Schiff pressed further. And isn't it possible, Detective, that the notebook entries represent nothing more than a teenager's fantasy writing or hypothetical scenario rather than actual murder planning? Roberts countered. The level of detail, including specific timing for entering each house, disabling specific security features, and notes about each. Victims' sleep patterns and vulnerability goes far beyond fantasy or hypothetical scenarios in my experience. This exchange established what would become a persistent theme in Lisa's defense, the argument that planning was not execution, and that thoughts, however disturbing, were not crimes in themselves. As the first day of the preliminary hearing concluded, Judge Hartman reminded all parties of the gag order prohibiting public comments about the case and scheduled testimony to continue the following morning with the medical examiner and forensic specialists. The national media coverage, limited to print journalists' observations, nonetheless captured the emerging narrative of what one prominent publication called a teenage Bonnie and Clyde whose obsessive relationship led to the calculated elimination of parental authority through violence. The courthouse steps became the site of impromptu vigils, with community members placing photographs of the victims alongside candles and flowers, a visual reminder of the 4 lives lost in what prosecutors characterized as a disturbing extension of adolescent rebellion to its most extreme and irreversible conclusion. The second day of the preliminary hearing brought a shift in focus from physical evidence to psychological dynamics, as prosecutor Charlotte Phillips called Dr. Elaine Martinez, a forensic psychologist specializing in adolescent criminality and coercive relationships. Her testimony would become one of the most controversial elements of the case, with both defense teams vigorously challenging her analysis from opposite directions. Dr. Martinez, who had reviewed the case evidence, interviewed both defendants, and analyzed their communications, entered the courtroom with the confident bearing of an expert who had testified in over 200 criminal proceedings over her 30-year career. Dr. Martinez, Phillips began, after establishing the witness's extensive credentials. Based on your professional assessment, how would you characterize the relationship dynamic between the defendants in the months leading up to the murders? Martinez adjusted her glasses thoughtfully before responding. What I observed was a classic example of what we term a folie à deux, a shared psychosis or delusion between two closely associated individuals. In this case, the shared delusion centered around the belief that their relationship was exceptionally unique and that the parents' ordinary boundaries represented an existential threat to this bond. Phillips guided Martinez through her analysis, with the psychologist explaining how the teen's relationship had evolved from typical adolescent attachment to something more disturbing. The text messages, social media interactions, and witness statements from friends show an increasing isolation from other social connections, growing paranoia about parental intentions, and an escalating belief that dramatic action was necessary to preserve their relationship, Martinez testified. She referenced specific communications, including a text message from Lisa to Brian stating, "No one in history has ever had what we have. They're trying to destroy something they can't understand." And within this folie à deux, did you observe distinct roles emerging between the defendants? Phillips asked, approaching what would become the most contentious aspect of the expert testimony. Martinez nodded. Yes. While both defendants participated in reinforcing the shared delusion, the evidence suggests different functional roles. Lisa Tolbert demonstrated characteristics consistent with what we would term the primary or inducer, the partner who typically initiates or intensifies the shared belief system. Brian Ferryman exhibited traits more consistent with the secondary or induced partner, more emotionally reactive, more dependent on the primary partner's approval, and more likely to act on the shared delusion when directed. This characterization immediately prompted objections from both defense attorneys, Schiff arguing it unfairly portrayed his client as the manipulator, while Livingston objected to the characterization of Brian as lacking agency. Judge Hartman overruled both objections, but cautioned the jury that Dr. Martinez's testimony represented expert opinion rather than established fact. Phillips continued, "What specific evidence led you to this assessment of their respective roles?" Martinez methodically outlined behavioral indicators, including Lisa's more strategic communications, her documented planning in the notebook, and her composed demeanor during interrogation compared to Brian's emotional volatility. In their text exchanges, we see Lisa repeatedly framing their situation in extreme terms. Us against the world. They'll never understand what we have. We need to take control. While Brian's responses typically express agreement and commitment to whatever course of action Lisa suggests. The psychologist added, particularly significant is how Lisa's language evolved over time, gradually normalizing the idea of violence as a solution through incremental steps, a process we call grooming for violence. The testimony took a more provocative turn when Phillips asked, "Based on your analysis of the defendant's communications and behavior, what can you tell us about their respective states of mind regarding the criminality and moral implications of their actions?" Martinez's response drew audible reactions from the gallery. The evidence suggests Lisa Tolbert maintained awareness of both the criminality and wrongfulness of the contemplated actions throughout the planning process. Her research into juvenile sentencing, forensic countermeasures, and methods to establish alibis demonstrates this awareness. Brian Ferryman also understood the actions were wrong in a legal sense, but appears to have experienced significant moral disengagement through what we call compartmentalization, the psychological process of separating the planned violence from his normal moral framework by framing it as necessary or justified. During cross-examination, Martha Livingston focused on reinforcing the portrayal of Brian as vulnerable to manipulation, having Dr. Martinez confirm that adolescents are particularly susceptible to influence due to still developing prefrontal cortex functions governing impulse control and long-term consequence assessment. Would you agree, Dr. Martinez, that a 16-year-old with Brian's history of seeking approval and validation would be especially vulnerable to manipulation by someone presenting violence as the only solution to a perceived threat to their relationship? Livingston asked. Martinez acknowledged this possibility while cautioning that susceptibility to influence did not eliminate moral responsibility. Warren Schiff's cross-examination took a more confrontational approach, challenging Martinez's methodology and conclusions. Dr. Martinez, isn't it true that folie à deux is a somewhat outdated concept that many modern psychiatrists consider overly simplistic for explaining complex interpersonal dynamics? He pressed. Martinez defended the terminology while acknowledging ongoing evolution in the field. Schiff continued, and isn't it equally possible, based on the evidence you've reviewed, that Brian Ferryman was the driving force behind the violence, with my client simply engaging in fantasy writing and theoretical discussions without actual intent to participate in murder? While possible, that interpretation is not consistent with the totality of evidence I reviewed, Martinez responded firmly. The systematic planning documented in Ms. Tolbert's notebook, her strategic approach during interrogation, and the progression of her communications with Brian all suggest she was, at minimum, an equal partner in developing the murder plan, and more likely the primary architect of its specific elements. This exchange highlighted the central tension of the case, both teens attempting to minimize their own role while maximizing the other's responsibility, creating a complex evidentiary challenge for both prosecution and defense. Following Dr. Martinez's testimony, Phillips called Sarah Winters, the guidance counselor who had discovered Lisa's notebook. Winters provided emotional testimony about finding the notebook during the safety inspection and her immediate concern upon seeing its contents. I've worked with teenagers for 17 years, and I've seen plenty of dark poetry, fictional stories, even angry rants about parents, she testified. This was different. It wasn't expressive or emotional. It was methodical, like someone planning a military operation. The detailed notes about when Mr. Tolbert took his sleep medication and exactly how many minutes it took to become effective weren't angry venting. They were tactical observations. Winters also provided insight into the teen's behavior in the weeks before the murders, describing how teachers had reported concerning changes in both students. Lisa had always been one of our most promising students, organized, articulate, focused on her future. Around April, teachers began noticing she was withdrawing from other friendships and activities, focusing exclusively on her relationship with Brian. Winters continued, in August, just before the new school year, her English teacher reported a disturbing theme in an essay Lisa wrote, describing parental authority as temporary obstacles that can be permanently removed when necessary. Under cross-examination by Schiff, Winters acknowledged that she had not reported this essay at the time, considering it concerning but not reaching the threshold for mandatory reporting of potential violence. Teenagers often use dramatic language and metaphors, Winters explained. In hindsight, combined with the notebook, it's clearly more significant than it appeared in isolation. This admission underscored a painful reality of the case multiple adults had observed concerning signs from both teens, but had interpreted them as typical adolescent intensity rather than warning signs of potential violence. The afternoon session brought testimony from Dr. Raymond Fulton, the medical examiner who had performed the autopsies on all 4 victims. His clinical description of the wounds and likely sequence of events provided scientific confirmation of what the prosecution had characterized as execution-style killings. The gunshot residue patterns indicate the weapon was fired from very close range, less than 12 inches in all cases, Dr. Fulton testified. The precision of the wounds, particularly in the cases of Everett Ferryman, Marisol Ferryman and Victor Tolbert, suggests the shooter was calm and deliberate rather than acting in a state of panic or extreme emotion. Particularly impactful was Dr. Fulton's assessment that 3 of the 4 victims had been killed while sleeping or just awakening, based on body positioning and the absence of defensive wounds. Only Nadine Tolbert shows evidence of having been fully awake and aware during the attack, he explained, referencing bruising on her arms consistent with raising them in a defensive posture. The bullet trajectories in her case suggest she was facing her attacker when shot, unlike the other victims. This testimony reinforced the prosecution's narrative of cold calculation rather than emotional outburst, a distinction critical to establishing the premeditation element of first-degree murder charges. Throughout Dr. Fulton's testimony, courtroom observers noted the dramatically different reactions of the defendants. Brian repeatedly looked down or closed his eyes during descriptions of the victim's wounds, at one point becoming visibly nauseated when autopsy photographs were shown to the judge, though not displayed to the gallery. Lisa, in contrast, watched the medical examiner's presentation with apparent clinical interest, taking notes occasionally and whispering questions to her attorney. This behavioral contrast would be noted by multiple media accounts, with one journalist describing Lisa as observing her parents' autopsy findings with the detached interest one might show a moderately engaging documentary. The day's final witness was digital forensics expert Kevin Zhang, who had analyzed the teens' electronic devices, social media accounts, and search histories. Zhang's testimony provided a digital timeline of escalation, beginning with increasingly controlling messages about their relationship in March and April, followed by the first mentions of removing obstacles in late July, and culminating in specific searches related to murder methods in the 2 weeks before the killings. On Lisa Tolbert's laptop, we found searches for topics including gunshot wound instant death, how to make murder look like home invasion, and countries without U.S. extradition, Zhang testified, projecting screenshots of the search history with dates and timestamps. Most damaging was Zhang's analysis of a secure messaging app the teens had begun using in August, which they believed deleted messages automatically, but which actually retained fragments in the device cache. We recovered partial conversations discussing what they termed the plan, including a message from Lisa to Brian stating, "Once it's done, we'll have complete freedom. No more restrictions, no more separation threats, just us deciding our own future." Zhang also testified about recovered messages showing Lisa directing Brian on specific elements of the plan. Remember to take their phones so it looks like a robbery. Wear the gloves from the moment you leave your room until you're back in the car. These digital fragments directly contradicted both teens' claims of innocence and supported the prosecution's portrayal of a calculated murder plot rather than impulsive violence. As the second day of the preliminary hearing concluded, Judge Hartman reviewed her notes and addressed the attorneys. Based on the evidence presented thus far, I'm prepared to rule that sufficient probable cause exists to proceed to trial on all charges against both defendants. Tomorrow, we will hear final witnesses and address the issue of whether the defendants should continue to be tried as adults or transferred to juvenile court. This preliminary determination sent visible ripples of tension through both defense teams, who had hoped to at least see some charges reduced before proceeding to trial. The media coverage following the day's testimony focused heavily on the psychological element, with headlines emphasizing the teenage Bonnie and Clyde angle and the disturbing dynamics of a relationship that had allegedly escalated from typical teenage intensity to murderous conspiracy. Outside the courthouse, community members continued to gather, with friends and colleagues of the Yena victims sharing memories that served as painful counterpoint to the clinical evidence being presented inside, reminders that beyond the psychological and forensic analyses were 4 lives suddenly and violently ended, leaving a community struggling to comprehend how two apparently promising teenagers had chosen murder as the solution to ordinary parental boundaries. The courtroom fell into stunned silence as prosecutor Charlotte Phillips held up an evidence bag containing several handwritten pages, the unexpected discovery that would dramatically reshape the trial's narrative. Your Honor, the state would like to introduce Exhibit 42, a 5-page letter discovered in Lisa Tolbert's backpack during the execution of the search warrant at the Grand Junction Motel, Phillips announced on the third day of proceedings. The document's existence had been known to both legal teams but kept from public disclosure until this strategic moment in the prosecution's case. This letter, written in Lisa Tolbert's handwriting and signed with her name, represents what appears to be a draft confession that places sole responsibility for the murders on Brian Ferryman. Judge Hartman examined the document briefly before allowing it to be entered into evidence, noting the defense's objections for the record. "Proceed, Ms. Phillips," she instructed, her expression revealing nothing of her assessment of this significant development. Phillips handed copies to the court reporter and defense attorneys before projecting enlarged images of the handwritten pages onto the evidence screen. The letter began with a formal address to law enforcement. "To whom it may concern, I, Lisa Tolbert, am writing this statement to clarify what happened to our parents and to correct any misunderstandings about my involvement." Reading aloud from the projected document, Phillips emphasized key passages. "Brian told me he couldn't stand his parents trying to separate us anymore. He said he had a plan that would solve everything, but I never believed he would actually go through with it." The letter continued with a detailed account, claiming Brian had acted alone in killing all 4 parents, while Lisa allegedly remained unaware until afterward. "When he came to pick me up that night, his hands were shaking and he told me what he'd done. He said we had to leave town immediately, that there was no going back now. I was terrified, but felt I had no choice but to go with him." The courtroom remained completely silent as Phillips continued reading the letter's calculated narrative, which portrayed Lisa as a frightened, unwilling accomplice after the fact rather than an active participant in planning or executing the murders. The final paragraph contained the most transparently self-serving language. "I know I should have contacted authorities immediately, but I was afraid of what Brian might do if I tried to leave or call for help. I'm writing this in case something happens to me, so the truth will be known. I never wanted anyone to be hurt." Phillips paused after finishing the reading, allowing the calculated attempt at misdirection to fully register with the judge before continuing. "Your Honor, what makes this document particularly significant is not just its content, but when it was written and why it was never submitted," Phillips explained. "Forensic analysis of the paper and ink indicates it was written in the motel room in Grand Junction, after the murders but before the defendants were apprehended. This was not a contemporaneous account written during or immediately after the crimes, but a calculated attempt to create an alternative narrative placing all responsibility on Brian Ferryman, a narrative Lisa Tolbert apparently decided not to use, perhaps realizing that physical evidence would contradict her claims of non-involvement. The revelation sent visible shockwaves through the courtroom, with Brian's attorney, Martha Livingston, immediately rising to her feet. "Your Honor, this document represents a deliberate attempt by Ms. Tolbert to frame my client and absolve herself of responsibility. It demonstrates the very manipulation we have argued characterized their relationship throughout." Judge Hartman acknowledged the objection while instructing Phillips to connect this evidence to the charges at hand rather than using it primarily to impugn Lisa's character. Phillips called FBI document analyst Terrence Wilson to authenticate the letter and explain its forensic significance. Wilson testified that handwriting analysis confirmed Lisa had written the letter likely on Saturday night or early Sunday morning based on the motel stationery and the ink characteristics. What's particularly interesting from an investigative perspective, as Wilson noted, is that the letter contains details about the crime scenes that were not publicly known at that point, specific information about how the victims were positioned, and the precise location of gunshot wounds. These details suggest first-hand knowledge of the crime scenes, rather than second-hand information received from another perpetrator. When cross-examined by Warren Schiff, Wilson acknowledged that the letter's existence could be interpreted multiple ways. It could represent an attempt to create a false narrative, as the prosecution suggests, or it could reflect Ms. Tolbert processing what had happened and deciding not to submit a false account. Schiff seized on this alternative interpretation. Isn't it equally possible that my client began writing this letter believing it to be true, that Brian had acted alone and she was uninvolved, and then chose not to submit it because she realized she needed proper legal representation rather than making unsubstantiated claims? The analyst conceded this was possible, but noted that the letter's detailed account of crime scene specifics was difficult to reconcile with someone who claimed no direct knowledge of the murders. The description of Nadine Tolbert confronting her killer in the kitchen, for instance, includes details that would not have been shared by someone merely confessing afterward. It suggests direct observation. This testimony reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of the letter as a calculated attempt to shift blame rather than a genuine account. The afternoon brought testimony from Brian's psychologist, Dr. Kenneth Walsh, who had conducted extensive evaluations of the teenager following his arrest. Dr. Walsh described Brian as exhibiting significant emotional dependence and approval-seeking behaviors, consistent with someone vulnerable to influence from a dominant personality. In our sessions, Brian repeatedly expressed that Lisa understood things no one else did, that she saw the bigger picture when others couldn't. This language suggests he had internalized her perspective as superior to his own judgment. Dr. Walsh testified that Brian showed genuine emotional distress when discussing the victims, unlike the flat affect he displayed when discussing the legal consequences he faced. When shown family photographs, Brian exhibited physiological stress responses, increased heart rate, perspiration, vocal tension, consistent with authentic emotional reaction rather than performed remorse. The psychologist also noted that during their sessions, Brian had begun to express confusion about the planning process, stating at one point, "I don't know why I thought this would fix anything. It seems crazy now, but it made perfect sense when Lisa explained it." Under cross-examination by Phillips, Dr. Walsh acknowledged the limitations of his assessment, conceding that emotional response to family photographs did not negate Brian's understanding of his actions or his active participation in the murders. Emotional distress after the fact is not incompatible with premeditation beforehand, Dr. Walsh stated. Many perpetrators of premeditated crimes experience genuine remorse once the consequences become real rather than theoretical. This testimony reinforced the prosecution's position that while Brian and Lisa might have had different psychological approaches to the murders, both had acted with full awareness of the wrongfulness and consequences of their actions. The courtroom dynamic shifted dramatically when Lisa's expert witness, Dr. Victoria Chen, a specialist in adolescent psychology, took the stand. Unlike Dr. Walsh's portrayal of Brian as emotionally vulnerable to manipulation, Dr. Chen characterized Lisa as exhibiting typical adolescent egocentrism, amplified by academic pressure and parental expectations. She testified that Lisa's behavior was consistent with a teenager engaged in fantasy planning and verbal expression of frustration rather than actual intent to commit violence. Adolescents frequently express thoughts and ideas they would never act upon, particularly in the context of romantic relationships where impression management is a significant factor, Dr. Chen explained. Phillips's cross-examination of Dr. Chen was among the most confrontational exchanges of the proceedings, with the prosecutor directly challenging the psychologist's interpretation of Lisa's behavior. Dr. Chen, are detailed notes about victims' sleep patterns and vulnerabilities typical of what you call adolescent fantasy planning? Phillips asked pointedly. When Chen attempted to contextualize this as possibly reflecting Lisa's general tendency toward thoroughness rather than actual murder planning, Phillips pressed further, and is researching gunshot wound fatality rates and methods to disable security systems also typical teenage behavior in your experience? The expert witness appeared increasingly uncomfortable as Phillips systematically contrasted general theories about adolescent behavior with the specific actions documented in Lisa's case. The exchange culminated in a particularly damaging moment when Phillips asked, "In your professional experience, Dr. Chen, is writing a false confession letter placing all blame on one's boyfriend consistent with what you've described as typical adolescent behavior?" Chen's hesitation before answering spoke volumes, and her eventual response, that would be unusual even within the context of adolescent relationship dynamics, effectively undermined much of her previous testimony, minimizing Lisa's actions as typical teenage behavior. The most dramatic moment of the day came when Phillips called Lisa's former best friend, Emma Lawson, to testify about conversations they had shared in the months before the murders. Lawson, visibly uncomfortable with her role in the proceedings, described how her friendship with Lisa had deteriorated as Lisa's relationship with Brian intensified. "She started talking differently around April," Lawson testified. "She used to be really focused on college applications and her future career, but suddenly everything was about how she and Brian were being controlled by their parents." Phillips gently guided Lawson through her recollections, eventually reaching the testimony's critical point. "Did Lisa ever discuss specific plans or ideas regarding her parents with you?" Lawson glanced briefly at Lisa before answering. "About 3 weeks before it happened, she asked me a really weird hypothetical question. She said, if someone's parents disappeared, would they be able to access their money and house as next of kin?" I thought she was talking about emancipation or something, not what actually happened. Lawson continued, her voice becoming strained. When I asked why she was thinking about that, she said something like, "Brian and I are exploring all our options for being together without interference." Then she laughed and said it was just a theoretical question for a creative writing assignment. This testimony provided independent corroboration that Lisa had been contemplating her parents' deaths as a solution weeks before the murders, directly contradicting her attorney's portrayal of her as uninvolved in planning the violence. The final witness of the day was Detective Noah Roberts, recalled to introduce new evidence discovered during the continuing investigation. During a secondary search of Lisa Tolbert's bedroom, executed under an expanded warrant based on digital evidence, we located a false bottom in her desk drawer, Roberts testified. Concealed within this hidden compartment was a USB drive containing a folder labeled Contingencies. This drive contained multiple versions of the letter found in her backpack at the motel, each with slightly different narratives, but all serving the same purpose, placing primary responsibility for the murders on Brian while minimizing her own involvement. Roberts explained that digital forensic analysis revealed these letters had been drafted over a 2-week period before the murders, not afterward, as the defense had suggested. The earliest version was created on September 1st, 13 days before the murders, Roberts testified, suggesting Ms. Tolbert was preparing multiple narrative options well in advance of the crimes, essentially creating predetermined alibis or explanations depending on how events unfolded. This revelation directly contradicted the defense's characterization of the letter as a spontaneous reaction to the murders and reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of Lisa as the calculating architect of both the crimes and the subsequent attempt to manage their legal consequences. As Judge Hartman called for the day's adjournment, the shift in courtroom atmosphere was palpable. What had begun as two parallel defense strategies, Brian portrayed as manipulated, Lisa as uninvolved, had been fundamentally destabilized by the letter's revelation and subsequent evidence. The letter had not only damaged Lisa's credibility, but had deepened the rift between the two defendants, with Brian's attorney now directly characterizing Lisa as deliberately attempting to frame her client. This deterioration of the united front they had initially presented reinforced Phillips' earlier characterization of their unbreakable bond, dissolving into mutual accusation when self-preservation became paramount. Outside the courthouse, media coverage focused heavily on the letter's revelation, with legal analysts discussing its significance as evidence of both premeditation and consciousness of guilt. Family members of the victims, who had maintained dignified silence throughout the proceedings, issued a joint statement through their representative. Today's revelations confirm what we have believed from the beginning, that these murders were not impulsive acts, but calculated decisions for which both defendants bear full responsibility. No amount of mutual blame-shifting can obscure the fact that four loving parents were executed for nothing more than setting appropriate boundaries for their children. The day's proceedings had shifted the case's trajectory significantly, strengthening the prosecution's argument for trying both teens as adults and undermining the defense strategies that had sought to minimize each client's responsibility by maximizing the others. Judge Hartman's decision on jurisdiction, juvenile versus adult court, now seemed increasingly likely to favor the prosecution's position that the level of calculation and premeditation demonstrated in the evidence justified adult charges despite the defendants' ages. What remained to be seen was how each defense team would adjust their strategies in response to the damaging revelations of the false confession letter and its implications for their respective clients. The courtroom fell into a hushed silence as Brian Ferryman took the stand on the fourth day of proceedings, his appearance markedly different from the composed teenager who had entered the motel room where he and Lisa were apprehended. 6 weeks of detention had left him thinner, with dark circles under his eyes and a pallor that suggested sleepless nights. His attorney, Martha Livingston, had made the calculated decision to have Brian testify in his own defense, a risky strategy that reflected the damage done by Lisa's drafted confession letter and the need to present Brian's perspective directly to the court rather than through expert witnesses. "Brian, I want you to tell the court about your relationship with Lisa Tolbert," Livingston began after establishing basic biographical information. Brian's voice was soft but steady as he recounted their first meeting in AP Chemistry the previous year, their initial friendship evolving into romance, and the gradual intensification of their connection. "At first, our parents were fine with us dating. They even joked about us both being so academically focused." He paused, his expression darkening slightly. "That changed around March, when Lisa started talking about applying only to colleges where I was also applying, changing her whole future plan to match mine." Livingston guided Brian through the relationship's evolution, having him describe the increasing restrictions both sets of parents had implemented. "My parents started checking my phone, setting earlier curfews, and eventually threatened to send me to my uncle's in Connecticut for my senior year. Lisa's parents were doing similar things, monitoring her locations, restricting when we could see each other." Brian explained how these boundaries had become, in Lisa's words, declarations of war against our relationship. He described Lisa's growing obsession with what she called permanent solutions, initially focused on legal options like emancipation, but gradually shifting toward more extreme ideas. "When did you first become aware that Lisa was considering violence as a solution?" Livingston asked directly. Brian swallowed hard before answering. It wasn't all at once. At first, she would say things like, "Don't you wish they would just disappear?" Or, "Imagine if we woke up tomorrow and all these rules were gone." I thought she was just venting. His voice grew strained as he continued. Then in August, she showed me the notebook. She had diagrams of both our houses, notes about when everyone slept, what medications they took. She called it our Freedom Plan. As Brian testified about the gradual evolution from hypothetical discussions to concrete planning, his demeanor shifted between moments of apparent remorse and defensive justification. Lisa said it was the only way we could be together forever, that they would never stop trying to separate us unless we took permanent action. He described how Lisa had framed the plan as an act of liberation rather than violence. She never used words like kill or murder. She would say things like remove the obstacles or clear our path. It somehow made it feel less real, like we were just solving a problem, not... His voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Livingston carefully led Brian to the night of the murders, having him describe how Lisa had allegedly orchestrated the timing and methodology. She had everything planned, when to leave our houses, what to wear, which doors to use. She had even practiced the route between our houses multiple times to know exactly how long it would take. Brian's testimony portrayed Lisa as the strategic mastermind who had planned every detail while he followed her lead, a narrative that aligned with his defense strategy but contradicted certain forensic evidence. When asked directly about who had pulled the trigger, Brian's testimony became notably evasive. It all happened so fast. We both went into both houses. Lisa had the gun at some points. I had it at others. This vague account prompted Judge Hartman to intervene, directing Brian to provide specific answers about his actions rather than general descriptions. Under this pressure, Brian admitted to being present in both houses during the murders, but continued to characterize Lisa as directing each step of the process, claiming, "She told me exactly where to stand, when to move, everything." The most dramatic moment of Brian's testimony came when Livingston showed him crime scene photographs of his parents' bedroom. His composed facade crumbled entirely as he looked at the images, breaking down in audible sobs that caused Judge Hartman to call a brief recess. When proceedings resumed, Brian appeared visibly shaken, his voice trembling as he attempted to continue. "I don't know why I thought this would solve anything. Lisa made it sound like the only way we could be together, like we were being forced to do it because everyone was against us. Now I can see how crazy that was, but then it seemed like our only option." Prosecutor Charlotte Phillips's cross-examination was methodical and relentless, systematically dismantling Brian's portrayal of himself as primarily Lisa's follower rather than an equal partner. "Mr. Ferryman, you've characterized Lisa as the primary planner of these murders. But isn't it true that the map of both neighborhoods found in your possession was drawn in your handwriting, not hers?" Brian acknowledged this was correct, attempting to explain it as copying Lisa's original design, an explanation Phillips quickly challenged by producing evidence that no similar map had been found in Lisa's possession. Phillips continued pressing on inconsistencies between Brian's testimony and the physical evidence. "You testified that Lisa directed you exactly where to stand, when to move, suggesting she was in control during the actual murders. Yet gunshot residue was found on your clothing in concentrations consistent with being the shooter in at least 3 of the 4 killings, according to the forensic analysis. How do you explain that?" Brian's response, that he couldn't remember exactly who had fired which shots, contradicted his earlier detailed recollections about other aspects of that night, a discrepancy Phillips highlighted repeatedly. The cross-examination reached its most damaging point when Phillips addressed the preparation for the crimes. "Mr. Ferryman, you testified that Lisa showed you the notebook with its plans in August, approximately 1 month before the murders. during that month, did you at any point consider telling your parents, a teacher, or any other adult about these plans? Brian's quiet no spoke volumes. Phillips pressed further. Did you take any steps to distance yourself from these plans, or to discourage Lisa from this course of action? Again, Brian acknowledged he had not. In fact, Phillips continued, credit card records show you personally purchased the gloves used in the murders, the cleaning supplies used to attempt to remove evidence, and the backpack in which the murder weapon was transported between houses. Would you characterize those as the actions of someone merely following another's lead? As the cross-examination continued, Brian's portrayal of himself as manipulated by Lisa became increasingly difficult to maintain in the face of evidence showing his active participation in both planning and execution. Phillips methodically established that regardless of who had originated the idea, Brian had taken numerous concrete actions that demonstrated his commitment to the murder plan, purchasing supplies, researching police response times, and disabling security features at his own home before the killings. By the time Phillips concluded her questioning, Brian's testimony had arguably done more harm than good to his defense strategy, reinforcing the prosecution's position that both teens had been active, knowing participants in the premeditated murders. Following Brian's testimony, the defense called Dr. Margaret Fuhrman, a neuroscientist specializing in adolescent brain development, who provided expert testimony about the still developing nature of the teenage brain, particularly in areas governing impulse, control, and risk assessment. The prefrontal cortex, which handles executive functions like weighing consequences and resisting peer influence, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s, Dr. Fuhrman explained. This biological reality means adolescents are more susceptible to emotional reasoning, more influenced by intense relationships, and less able to consider long-term consequences than adults. Dr. Fuhrman carefully avoided directly excusing Brian's actions while providing scientific context for the defense's argument that his age and developmental stage had made him particularly vulnerable to manipulation within an intense relationship. Adolescents in emotionally charged romantic relationships can experience a form of tunnel vision, where maintaining that relationship becomes prioritized above all other considerations, including their own best interests or moral boundaries they would normally observe. This testimony provided scientific underpinning for Livingston's portrayal of Brian as developmentally vulnerable to Lisa's influence, though it did not directly address his active participation in the murders. When Warren Schiff cross-examined Dr. Fuhrman, he established that these same developmental factors would apply equally to Lisa, potentially undermining the defense's attempt to characterize her as the calculating manipulator and Brian as the manipulated teenager. Would you agree, Dr. Fuhrman, that these same developmental limitations would affect both defendants, given their similar ages? The neuroscientist acknowledged this was correct, though she noted that individual differences in development could mean some adolescents have more advanced executive function than others at the same chronological age. As Brian's defense presentation concluded, Judge Hartman called a brief recess before Lisa's attorney would present his case. During this break, media commentary focused on the strategic error Brian's testimony might represent, with several legal analysts suggesting that his attempt to portray himself as primarily following Lisa's lead had been undermined by the physical evidence of his active participation. The prosecution's case that both teens had been knowing, willing participants in a calculated murder plot had been inadvertently strengthened by Brian's own words. When court resumed, Warren Schiff presented a dramatically different defense for Lisa Tolbert, one that directly contradicted Brian's testimony on multiple key points. Rather than calling Lisa to testify, a decision widely interpreted as recognition that she would face devastating cross-examination given the evidence, Schiff relied on expert witnesses and character testimony to present Lisa as a high-achieving student who had engaged in fantasy planning but never intended actual violence. Dr. Victoria Chen returned to the stand, expanding on her earlier testimony about adolescent behavior to suggest that Lisa's notebook represented elaborate fantasy rather than actual murder planning, a theory that struggled to account for the subsequent reality of 4 murdered parents. Schiff also called several of Lisa's former teachers who testified to her exceptional academic performance, leadership in school activities, and apparent psychological stability before her relationship with Brian had become all-consuming. Her calculus teacher described Lisa as one of the most rational, measured students I've ever taught, while her debate coach recalled her remarkable ability to see multiple perspectives and find logical solutions to complex problems. This testimony aimed to establish Lisa as inherently unlikely to resort to violence, though Phillips would later argue in closing statements that these same traits, rationality, problem-solving, and strategic thinking, had been applied to the calculated elimination of parental authority through murder. The most compelling witness in Lisa's defense was Dr. Eleanor Winters, a forensic psychiatrist who had conducted extensive evaluations of Lisa following her arrest. Dr. Winters testified that Lisa exhibited significant compartmentalization abilities that allowed her to engage in planning and discussion of violence as an intellectual exercise without fully processing the emotional and moral implications. In our sessions, Ms. Tolbert demonstrated an almost dissociative quality when discussing the actual events of the murders as opposed to the theoretical planning that preceded them, Dr. Winters explained. This suggests she may have engaged in the planning process as a form of elaborate fantasy that she did not fully expect to materialize into action. Phillips's cross-examination of Dr. Winters was particularly effective, focusing on the inconsistency between this theory and Lisa's documented behavior before, during, and after the murders. Dr. Winters, you've characterized Lisa's planning as fantasy. She didn't expect to become reality. How do you reconcile that with her purchasing one-way bus tickets to Canada 3 days before the murders, or her transferring $3,000 from her savings account to a newly created account under a different name? These previously undisclosed details of the investigation landed with visible impact in the courtroom, directly contradicting the portrait of Lisa as engaged in mere theoretical planning. When Dr. Winters attempted to explain these actions as potentially part of the same fantasy planning, Phillips pressed further. And the false confession letter placing blame on Brian, was that also fantasy planning? Or was that a very real, very calculated attempt to escape consequences by sacrificing her boyfriend? The psychiatrist's hesitation before answering spoke volumes, and her eventual response that the letter suggests a level of strategic thinking about potential legal outcomes effectively undermined her earlier characterization of Lisa as not truly expecting the violence to occur. As the 4th day of proceedings concluded, both defense teams had presented their core arguments. Brian as the manipulated follower who had participated but allegedly under Lisa's influence, and Lisa as the rational student engaged in elaborate fantasy planning who had not fully intended the theoretical discussions to result in actual violence. Both narratives struggled against the weight of physical evidence showing active participation by both teens and the documented preparations that clearly indicated premeditation and awareness of the criminality of their actions. In the courtroom's gallery, the extended families of both the Ferrymans and Tolberts maintained the dignified silence they had observed throughout the proceedings, though observers noted how they flinched during certain moments of particularly callous characterization of the victims as obstacles to the teens' relationship. The community of Aspen initially shocked by the quadruple homicide, had now settled into a somber recognition of the calculated nature of the crimes, with vigils continuing nightly for the victims while mental health professionals conducted workshops for local parents and teenagers about recognizing warning signs of potentially violent relationships. As the preliminary hearing approached its conclusion, with closing arguments scheduled for the following day, the central questions facing Judge Hartman remained clear. Were these crimes the result of calculated, premeditated planning by both teens, justifying adult charges and potential life sentences? Or were they the tragic outcome of adolescent impulsivity and underdeveloped judgment, warranting consideration of the juvenile justice system's greater emphasis on rehabilitation? The evidence increasingly pointed toward the former, but the final decision on jurisdiction would hinge on how the judge weighed the teen's chronological age against the adult-like calculation evident in their actions. The final day of testimony began with the prosecution's most devastating revelation yet, evidence that fundamentally undermined Lisa's claim that murder had been their only escape from parental control. "Your Honor," Charlotte Phillips announced, approaching the bench with a manila folder, "the state wishes to introduce Exhibit 58, documentation discovered through subpoena of the Pitkin County Court's Family Division records." Judge Hartman reviewed the documents briefly before allowing them to be entered into evidence, her expression betraying a moment of genuine surprise at their contents. The court will recognize these documents as an application for legal emancipation filed by Lisa Tolbert on August 27, 2024, 18 days before the murders, Phillips explained, displaying the first page on the evidence screen. This application, properly filed and in process, would have granted Ms. Tolbert legal independence from parental control upon approval. A hearing was scheduled for September 30th, just 2 weeks after the date when her parents were murdered. The revelation sent visible ripples through the courtroom, with spectators murmuring in shock until Judge Hartman called for order. Phillips methodically walked the court through the emancipation application, which included detailed documentation of Lisa's academic achievements, part-time job income, savings account balance, and plans for independent living. Ms. Tolbert had assembled a compelling case for emancipation, Phillips noted, including letters of support from 2 teachers and documentation of a scholarship offer from Colorado State University that would have covered most of her educational expenses. The application included a personal statement in Lisa's handwriting, citing irreconcilable differences in life goals and educational plans with her parents, and requesting legal independence to pursue my academic and personal development without constant conflict. What makes this evidence particularly significant, Phillips continued, is that it directly contradicts the central narrative both defendants have presented, that murder was their only option for escaping parental control. Lisa Tolbert had already initiated a legal process that likely would have granted her independence within weeks of the murders. She was not only aware of legal alternatives to violence, but was actively pursuing them, even as she and Brian Ferryman were simultaneously planning the murders of their parents. Warren Schiff immediately objected, arguing that the emancipation application had not been properly disclosed during discovery and represented an ambush tactic by the prosecution. Judge Hartman overruled the objection after Phillips explained that the records had only been obtained 2 days prior following a specialized subpoena of sealed family court records. These documents were not in the prosecution's possession during initial discovery, Your Honor, and were provided to the defense immediately upon receipt, Phillips clarified. Judge Hartman permitted the evidence while granting the defense additional time to review the documents and prepare response arguments. Phillips called family court clerk Marjorie Bennett, who testified about the typical timeline and success rate for emancipation petitions with documentation comparable to Lisa's application. "Based on my 17 years of experience with the Family Division, Ms. Tolbert's application was extremely thorough and well documented compared to most we receive, Bennett testified. With her academic record, financial stability, and teacher recommendations, it would have received favorable consideration at the September 30th hearing. This testimony reinforced the prosecution's argument that Lisa had been pursuing a viable legal alternative to parental control even while planning their murders. Most damaging was Bennett's testimony about a notation in the file indicating Lisa had called on September 12th, just 2 days before the murders, to confirm her hearing date, suggesting the emancipation application was not an abandoned idea but an active process running parallel to the murder planning. This chronology directly contradicted both teens' claims that they had felt trapped with no alternatives to violence, a central element of both defense strategies. The revelation of the emancipation application fundamentally shifted the case's psychological framework from desperate teenagers seeing no way out to calculating individuals choosing murder over readily available legal alternatives. When court resumed after lunch, Warren Schiff attempted to mitigate the damage by calling Lisa's former government teacher, who testified that their class had completed a project on minor emancipation laws the previous spring. All students were required to complete a sample emancipation application as part of understanding the legal process, the teacher explained, suggesting the filed application might have originated as a class assignment rather than a serious intention. This explanation struggled under cross-examination, however, when Phillips established that the actual filed application contained information and documentation far beyond the classroom template, including Lisa's work history and financial records that would not have been part of a hypothetical exercise. The afternoon brought testimony from Dr. Raymond Carter, a forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated both teenagers at the court's request for an independent assessment of their mental states. Unlike the experts hired by either defense team, Dr. Carter had conducted joint and individual sessions with both teens, providing unique insight into their dynamic. What I observed was a relationship characterized by mutual reinforcement rather than one-sided manipulation, Dr. Carter testified. Both exhibited what we call confirmation bias in isolation, the tendency for isolated individuals to validate each other's perspectives while filtering out contradictory viewpoints. Dr. Carter's testimony directly challenged both defense narratives, Brian's claim of being manipulated by Lisa and Lisa's portrayal of herself as engaged in fantasy planning without true intent. The evidence suggests both defendants moved through a process of moral disengagement together, gradually normalizing the idea of murder through mutual reinforcement, the psychiatrist explained. Their text messages show a pattern of escalating language where one would suggest an extreme idea, the other would validate and slightly extend it, creating a feedback loop that moved them incrementally toward violence. Most significantly, Dr. Carter testified that both teens demonstrated awareness of alternative options they had rejected. In my sessions with Brian, he acknowledged being aware that Lisa was turning 18 in November and would legally be an adult, potentially free from parental restrictions. When I asked why they couldn't wait until then, he stated, "Lisa said waiting would give our parents more time to implement their separation plans." This indicates awareness of alternatives, but impatience with their timeline. Similarly, Dr. Carter reported that Lisa had acknowledged knowing about legal emancipation as an option, but had expressed concern it might not be approved in time and wouldn't solve Brian's situation. This testimony directly contradicted both teens' claims of feeling trapped with no alternatives, instead suggesting they had chosen murder as the fastest, most complete solution rather than pursuing legal options with longer timelines. Dr. Carter concluded, "Based on my evaluation, both defendants understood the wrongfulness of their actions, comprehended the finality of murder, and were capable of considering alternatives. Their decision to proceed with violence appears to have been driven not by lack of options but by unwillingness to accept the uncertainty or delay associated with legal alternatives. The prosecution's case concluded with Detective Noah Roberts returning to the stand to introduce final evidence regarding the teens' post-murder plans. During further analysis of Lisa Tolbert's devices, digital forensics discovered a deleted document titled Next Steps, created 3 days before the murders, Roberts testified. The document contained detailed plans for the weeks following their parents' deaths, including funeral attendance, expected inheritance details, and plans to sell both family homes once they gained control of their parents' estates. The document included a note to maintain appropriate grief behaviors in public and consult parents' attorneys about accessing accounts before probate. Roberts also testified about browser history, showing research into how quickly life insurance policies pay out and whether minors can inherit as sole beneficiaries, searches conducted in the week before the murders. This evidence of financial planning directly contradicted both teens' portrayal of the murders as an emotional response to relationship restrictions, instead suggesting calculation about the potential financial benefits of becoming orphans. These searches and documents indicate planning that went beyond simply removing parental authority, Roberts concluded. They show consideration of the financial advantages that would result from their parents' deaths. As the evidence portion of the hearing concluded, Judge Hartman addressed both legal teams. Based on the testimony and evidence presented, I am prepared to rule on the question of jurisdiction tomorrow after closing arguments. I will note for the record that the revelation of Ms. Tolbert's emancipation application introduces significant new context for assessing the defendant's claims regarding lack of alternatives to violence. This statement suggested the emancipation revelation had potentially shifted the judge's perspective on one of the central questions before her: whether the crimes warranted trial in juvenile or adult court. Charlotte Phillips delivered a powerful closing argument, methodically connecting the evidence to establish both premeditation and the teens' full awareness of their actions' wrongfulness. Your Honor, the evidence presented over these 5 days tells a clear and disturbing story of calculation rather than impulse, of choice rather than desperation. She systematically reviewed the notebook planning, digital evidence, forensic findings, and psychological testimony, weaving them into a cohesive narrative of two teenagers who had chosen murder as their preferred solution, despite having legal alternatives available. The emancipation application is perhaps the most revealing piece of evidence in this entire case, Phillips argued. It demonstrates that Lisa Tolbert was fully aware of legal remedies for her situation and was actively pursuing them. Yet simultaneously, she and Brian Ferryman were planning the murders of their parents, not because they had no alternatives, but because murder offered a faster, more complete solution that also potentially provided financial benefits through inheritance. This characterization directly addressed the key question before Judge Hartman, whether the crimes reflected adolescent impulsivity warranting juvenile jurisdiction or adult-like calculation justifying adult charges. Phillips concluded by directly addressing the defendants' ages. The law recognizes that chronological age does not always align with decision-making capacity or moral understanding. These defendants may be chronologically 16 and 17, but the evidence shows they acted with adult calculation, adult awareness of consequences, and adult rejection of available legal alternatives. The premeditation evident in this case, planning conducted over weeks, not moments, demonstrates a level of criminal sophistication that warrants adult consequences under our justice system. Martha Livingston's closing argument for Brian emphasized his lesser role in the planning, his documented emotional vulnerability, and his genuine remorse, as evidenced by his emotional breakdown during testimony. Brian Ferryman is, first and foremost, a 16-year-old whose brain is still developing, particularly in areas governing impulse control and resistance to peer influence, she argued. While he participated in these tragic events, the evidence shows his involvement was shaped by the influence of his co-defendant within an intensely emotional relationship that became his entire world. Livingston strategically acknowledged Brian's criminal responsibility while arguing that his age, developmental stage, and role as follower rather than leader warranted juvenile rather than adult jurisdiction. Warren Schiff presented the most challenging closing argument, attempting to reconcile the emancipation application with Lisa's defense narrative. The existence of this application actually supports our contention that Ms. Tolbert was focused on legal remedies, not violence, he argued, suggesting that the murder plan might have been primarily Brian's initiative, while Lisa was simultaneously pursuing legal independence. This argument struggled against the documented evidence of Lisa's active participation in planning the murders during the same time frame she was filing for emancipation. Schiff emphasized Lisa's academic achievements, lack of prior behavioral issues, and the developmental factors affecting all adolescents, arguing that even exceptional teenagers remain works in progress neurologically, regardless of their academic capabilities. As the closing arguments concluded, Judge Hartman announced she would deliver her ruling on jurisdiction the following morning, along with a determination regarding probable cause to proceed to trial on all charges. The courtroom emptied into a media frenzy, with legal analysts universally acknowledging that the emancipation application had fundamentally altered the case narrative. The revelation had transformed the psychological framework from troubled teenagers seeing no alternatives to calculating individuals choosing murder over available legal remedies, a distinction with profound implications for how the justice system would process their cases. Throughout the community, the case had prompted difficult conversations about adolescent relationships, parental boundaries, and warning signs of potentially dangerous fixations. School counselors reported increased requests from parents for guidance on appropriate monitoring of teenage relationships, while mental health professionals conducted workshops on recognizing the difference between typical adolescent intensity and potentially harmful obsession. As Aspen prepared for Judge Hartman's ruling, the fundamental question remained: how should society respond when teenagers with still developing brains commit crimes demonstrating adult-like calculation and disregard for human life? The Pitkin County Courthouse steps were crowded with media representatives, community members, and the extended families of both victims and defendants as dawn broke on the day of Judge Eleanor Hartman's ruling. Inside, the courtroom had been prepared for increased security, with additional bailiffs positioned throughout the space and strict protocols for entry and exit. By 9 a.m., every seat was filled as Judge Hartman entered and took her place at the bench, her expression giving no indication of her decision as she arranged her papers methodically before addressing the courtroom. This court has carefully considered the evidence presented during this 5-day preliminary hearing to determine 2 critical questions, Judge Hartman began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. First, whether probable cause exists to proceed to trial on the charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and first-degree burglary against both defendants. Second, whether these proceedings should continue in adult criminal court or be transferred to juvenile jurisdiction, given the defendants' ages of 16 and 17 years. The judge's deliberate pacing emphasized the gravity of her decision, which would fundamentally shape how the justice system processed these unprecedented crimes in Aspen's history. Regarding the first question, this court finds that overwhelming probable cause exists to proceed to trial on all charges against both defendants. Judge Hartman stated firmly. The physical evidence, digital communications, planning documentation, and expert testimony collectively establish a clear case of premeditated action by both Brian Ferryman and Lisa Tolbert in the deaths of Everett and Marisol Ferryman and Victor and Nadine Tolbert. This determination, while significant, had been largely expected given the extensive evidence presented during the hearing. Judge Hartman then turned to the more contentious question of jurisdiction. Colorado law provides specific factors for courts to consider when determining whether juvenile defendants should be tried as adults, including the nature and seriousness of the alleged offense, the age and maturity of the juvenile, and whether the juvenile's needs would be better addressed by juvenile or adult facilities. She methodically reviewed these factors as they applied to the specific circumstances of the case, noting that quadruple homicide represented the most serious criminal offense possible and that both teens were in the upper age range of juvenile jurisdiction. Particularly significant in this determination, Judge Hartman continued, is the extensive evidence of premeditation, calculation, and awareness of alternatives demonstrated by both defendants. Here she directly referenced the emancipation application that had dramatically altered the case narrative in its final days. The fact that Lisa Tolbert was actively pursuing legal emancipation concurrent with planning these murders fundamentally undermines the claim that both defendants felt trapped with no alternatives to violence. This suggests a level of deliberate choice rather than desperate action that weighs heavily toward adult jurisdiction. After reviewing additional factors including the defendants' academic histories, psychological evaluations, and family backgrounds, Judge Hartman delivered her ruling. It is therefore the finding of this court that both Brian Ferryman and Lisa Tolbert shall be tried as adults on all charges. While the court acknowledges their chronological ages as teenagers, the evidence demonstrates a level of criminal sophistication, premeditation, and awareness of consequences more consistent with adult criminal responsibility than adolescent impulsivity. The ruling sent visible reactions through the courtroom, resigned nods from the prosecution team, tight expressions from defense attorneys, and quiet weeping from several family members. Judge Hartman continued, setting trial dates 4 months hence and establishing pre-trial deadlines for motions and additional discovery. She concluded by addressing bail, which had not been previously determined due to the pending jurisdiction question. Given the severity of the charges and the calculated nature of the alleged crimes, both defendants shall remain held without bail pending trial. As court adjourned, media representatives rushed to file their stories, while family members of the victims gathered in a private room with victim advocates to process the ruling. Outside the courthouse, community members had organized a memorial display with photographs of all 4 victims, Everett and Marisol Ferryman, Victor and Nadine Tolbert, surrounded by flowers and messages remembering their contributions to Aspen. The visual reminder of the human lives lost served as powerful counterpoint to the clinical legal proceedings inside, grounding the community's understanding of the case in its human impact rather than its procedural elements. 6 months later, following separate trials that featured much of the same evidence presented during the preliminary hearing, both Brian Ferryman and Lisa Tolbert were convicted on all counts. The trials, while legally separate, had proceeded along parallel tracks, with each defense continuing to characterize their client as less culpable than the co-defendant. This strategy proved ineffective against the overwhelming physical evidence and documented planning that established both teens as knowing, willing participants in the premeditated quadruple homicide. The sentencing hearing, held jointly at the prosecution's request, brought the case to its conclusion on a cold February morning. Charlotte Phillips argued forcefully for maximum sentences for both defendants, emphasizing the calculated nature of the crimes, the vulnerability of the sleeping victims, and the defendants' continued attempts to minimize their responsibility. These were not crimes of passion or momentary rage, Phillips reminded the court. They were the culmination of weeks of planning, research, and preparation, the methodical elimination of 4 lives solely because they represented authority and boundaries these defendants refused to accept. Defense attorneys made their final arguments for leniency based primarily on the defendants' ages and potential for rehabilitation, with Martha Livingston emphasizing Brian's emotional breakdown during trial testimony as evidence of genuine remorse. Warren Schiff focused on Lisa's academic potential and lack of prior behavioral issues, arguing that her actions represented an aberration rather than a pattern. Both attorneys requested the minimum sentences available under Colorado law for adult murder convictions, with eligibility for parole after 25 years. Before delivering her sentence, Judge Hartman permitted impact statements from family members of the victims. Marisol Ferryman's sister spoke of the devastating loss to her family, describing how her nephews and nieces would grow up without grandparents because of Brian and Lisa's selfish, incomprehensible choice. Victor Tolbert's brother addressed Lisa directly, his voice breaking as he described Victor's pride in her academic achievements and how he had spoken of her potential just days before his murder. "He believed in your future, even as you were planning to end his life," he stated, the simple truth landing with devastating impact in the silent courtroom. Most powerful was a joint statement delivered by cousins representing both families, addressing the court rather than the defendants directly. "These murders have permanently altered the fabric of 2 families who were bound by friendship before they were bound by tragedy," the statement began. 4 people who contributed daily to their community, who supported others, who worked and loved and planned for futures they would never see, were eliminated from this world because they committed the apparent offense of setting reasonable boundaries for their children. The statement concluded with a request that the court impose sentences reflecting not vengeance, but appropriate consequences for choices made with full awareness of their gravity. When the defendants were offered their opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Brian spoke first, his voice barely audible at times as he expressed remorse that seemed genuine if belated. "I know nothing I say can bring them back or fix what we did," he stated, his shoulders hunched and eyes downcast. "I think about them every day and night. I don't understand anymore how I could have thought this was a solution to anything." His statement, while emotional, still contained elements of distancing, referring to what happened, rather than directly acknowledging his active role in the murders. Lisa's statement contrasted sharply with Brian's emotional delivery, her composed demeanor and carefully constructed language reflecting the same calculation evident throughout the proceedings. "I recognize the gravity of my actions and accept the court's judgment," she stated, her voice steady and expression controlled. "I can only express my deepest regret to the families affected by this tragedy." The clinical phrasing and absence of direct acknowledgement of her victims or her specific role in their deaths reinforced the impression of someone intellectualizing events rather than experiencing genuine emotional remorse. Judge Hartman then delivered her sentencing decision, beginning with a review of the case's most significant elements. "The court has rarely encountered crimes that combined such calculated premeditation with such apparent disregard for human life," she stated. The evidence presented at trial established beyond any doubt that both defendants engaged in extensive planning over weeks, researched methods to avoid detection, and methodically executed 4 human beings whose only offense was attempting to provide appropriate structure and boundaries for their children. The judge specifically addressed the defendant's ages as mitigating factors she had considered deeply. Our legal system recognizes that adolescents are different from adults in their decision-making capabilities, impulse control, and susceptibility to influence. However, the law also recognizes that certain crimes transcend these age-based considerations through their calculated nature and extreme gravity. She noted that she had reviewed all available research on adolescent brain development and had carefully weighed these factors against the specific circumstances of the case. After considerable deliberation, Judge Hartman announced, this court sentences both Brian Ferryman and Lisa Tolbert to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years on each count of first-degree murder, to be served concurrently. The sentence, 5 years longer than the minimum requested by defense attorneys, but significantly less than the life without parole that could have been imposed, reflected Judge Hartman's weighing of the defendants' ages against the calculated nature of their crimes. The judge then added a final, unprecedented element to her sentencing order. As an additional condition of sentencing, this court orders that the defendants shall have no contact with each other for the duration of their incarceration through any means, written, electronic, telephonic, or through third parties. They shall be housed in separate facilities, and any violation of this no-contact order will result in loss of privileges and potential impact on parole eligibility. This provision, which legal analysts would later describe as the Romeo and Juliet clause, in reference to the case's distorted parallel to the classic tale of forbidden love, ensured that the relationship that had allegedly driven the teens to murder would be permanently severed by the justice system. This separation provision, Judge Hartman explained, reflects the court's assessment that the defendants' relationship represented a destructive folie à deux that facilitated their moral disengagement and mutual reinforcement of violent ideation. Rehabilitation will require each defendant to develop an independent identity and moral framework, rather than continuing the pathological dynamic that contributed to these crimes. The unusual provision would later be challenged by both defense teams, but was ultimately upheld on appeal as within the court's discretion for public safety and rehabilitation purposes. As the sentencing hearing concluded, Brian glanced toward Lisa one final time before being led from the courtroom. A look she did not return, her gaze fixed forward as she was escorted separately to begin processing into the state correctional system. This final non-interaction symbolized the permanent severance of a relationship that had allegedly been worth killing for just months earlier, a bond now dissolved in the face of 3-decade minimum sentences and court-ordered separation. In the months and years that followed, the case would become the subject of criminology studies, psychological analyses, and ongoing debate about adolescent brain development versus criminal responsibility. Both families established scholarship funds in honor of the victims, supporting counseling programs focused on healthy relationships for teenagers. The Aspen Heights Academy instituted new protocols for identifying concerning relationship patterns among students, with counselor Sarah Winters leading workshops for educators across Colorado on recognizing warning signs of potentially dangerous fixations. 1 year after sentencing, documentary filmmakers interviewed key figures from the case for a feature that explored the psychology behind the crimes. Detective Noah Roberts, reflecting on what most disturbed him about the case, referenced the notebook phrase that had become emblematic of its calculated nature. After Saturday, nothing stands in our way. The detective observed, what they never seemed to grasp was that they were creating a much more permanent obstacle than anything their parents had imposed. 30 years minimum of separation, with no guarantee of parole even then. Their solution created a barrier far more insurmountable than the temporary boundaries of adolescence. Charlotte Phillips, who had successfully prosecuted what became the defining case of her career, offered similar reflection. This case represented the darkest extension of adolescent self-focus, the inability to recognize that parents are human beings with lives and value beyond their relationship to their children. In their minds, eliminating 4 people was justified because those people represented obstacles to their immediate desires. It's a failure of perspective and empathy that transcended typical teenage self-centeredness to become something truly monstrous. 5 years after the sentencing, Brian's rehabilitation journey showed promising signs, with his participation in Victims Impact programming and educational opportunities suggesting genuine growth and remorse. Lisa's institutional record, while perfect in terms of behavioral compliance, reflected less emotional development, with psychological evaluations noting her continued tendency toward intellectual rather than emotional processing of her crimes. Both remained decades away from potential parole consideration, their separation enforced by facilities hundreds of miles apart and strict enforcement of the no-contact provision of their sentencing. The case that had begun with a notebook containing the chilling phrase, "After Saturday, nothing stands in our way," had ended with a fundamental reordering of boundaries, not their elimination, as the teens had planned, but their transformation into the walls of separate correctional institutions and a court order ensuring their permanent separation. The relationship they had killed to preserve had dissolved in the face of consequences, their claimed, unbreakable bond proving far more fragile than the lives they had taken. For the families left behind, the painful process of rebuilding continued, their lives forever altered by a calculated choice that had prioritized teenage passion over 4 human lives, a decision that had placed 4 coffins rather than merely rules and curfews in the path of an obsessive relationship that had consumed everything in its way, including ultimately itself.